Have you ever wondered why the Bible so intentionally mentions Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve, after the tragic story of Cain and Abel? Why doesn't the biblical narrative end with Abel's death or resolve solely around Cain? What if, and stay with me here, what if Seth was actually the most important son of Adam? This might sound surprising. After all, Seth doesn't slay his brother. He doesn't build cities. There are no dramatic stories or fiery judgments connected to his name. He kind of appears in the background, quietly. And yet, what if that quietness is precisely what makes him so important? Let's look into the scripture and history to uncover the deeper meaning of Seth's story, because hidden within a few verses may be a powerful truth about legacy, godliness, and God's redemption plan for all of humanity. Hidden in his story are truths that will stir your soul and challenge how you see your own purpose. Genesis 4 shows us the painful story of Cain and Abel. Cain, the firstborn, murders his younger brother in a jealous rage, and in that moment, Adam and Eve not only lose a son, they lose two. One is dead, and the other is spiritually lost, cursed, and wandering. In Genesis chapter 4:25, it says, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him." The name Seth in Hebrew comes from the word sheth, meaning appointed or placed. Eve is making a declaration. God himself has appointed Seth. That word matters. It isn't just a random third child. This is a child chosen, given as a divine replacement. Not just any replacement, a redemptive one. This wasn't about filling a vacancy. This was about restoring a broken line. Eve's words are telling. She recognized God's hand in Seth's birth. He was appointed, not just born. That language echoes Genesis 3:15, the first prophecy of redemption where God promised that the seed of the woman would one day crush the serpent. Could it be that in Seth, Eve saw a glimmer of that promise restored? From Seth onward, something shifts. Genesis 4 ends with his son Enosh, and then it says something incredibly significant in verse 26. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. This appears to be the first recorded revival, a spiritual awakening. It didn't begin with Cain. It didn't begin with Abel. It began with the line of Seth. Why is this so important? Because in the early Genesis narrative, humans are drifting. Cain's line is building cities, creating music and metalwork, but also violence and polygamy. Lamech, Cain's descendant, brags about murder. Civilization is growing, but righteousness is shrinking. And in the midst of that darkness, Seth's line becomes a light. Jewish tradition and early Christian writings say Seth was not just Adam's son physically, but spiritually. Genesis 5:3 says, when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. Now wait, did you catch that? In his own likeness, after his image. That's the same language used when God created man in his image, Genesis 1:26. It's like a spiritual mirror. Seth wasn't just filling Abel's role, he was carrying God's image forward. This contrast between Cain's descendants and Seth's becomes the backdrop for the entire Genesis narrative. In Luke chapter 3, verses 23 through 38, we read the genealogy of Jesus. It doesn't stop with David or Abraham. It goes all the way back to Adam. And who is the connecting figure between Adam and Abraham? It isn't Cain. It isn't Abel. It's Seth. Luke 3:38, the son of Enosh, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. That's a direct line from the Messiah to the man Eve declared as appointed by God. So when we say Seth may be the most important son of Adam, we're not exaggerating. We're recognizing that the very line that would bring forth Jesus Christ began with him. His life marks the preservation of the messianic promise that God gave in Genesis 3:15, that the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head. Jesus, the second Adam, the Redeemer of humanity, traces his earthly ancestry to Seth. This matters because it connects Jesus directly to the legacy of righteousness, the spiritual line that began with Seth and continued through Noah, Abraham, David, and beyond. It also reminds us God always preserves a remnant. Even in chaos, even in murder, even in the collapse of innocence, God appoints a line of hope. But let's take this even deeper. What if Seth was not just the link to Jesus, but a foreshadowing of him? Think about it. Abel, the innocent one, is slain, and his blood cries out from the ground. In Hebrews 12:24, it says that Jesus' blood speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Abel's death cries out for justice. Jesus' death brings mercy. And then comes Seth, the appointed son after death. He represents a new beginning, a redemptive hope. Jesus, too, is the appointed son. After the death and fall of humanity, he comes as the one who restores what was lost. He is the true Seth, the one who carries the divine legacy and becomes the source of salvation for all. So Seth isn't just a historical figure. He's a picture, a shadow of the greater appointed son to come. Seth isn't flashy. He doesn't have dramatic moments, but maybe that's the point. We live in a culture addicted to the spotlight, but God's kingdom often moves in the shadows. What if your greatest impact isn't in what you do, but in who you raise, who you disciple, who you influence quietly? How often do we discount what God is doing in the quiet? How often do we think of our lives as insignificant because we're not building empires or standing in the spotlight? But Seth's life reminds us that faithfulness, not fame, is what builds generational impact. He passed on faith to Enosh. Enosh passed it on to his son. That chain of righteousness eventually brought Enoch, who walked with God. Then Methuselah, then Lamech, then Noah, who saved the world. Noah is described in Genesis 6, verse 9, as a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God. Sound familiar? He's walking the same path that started with Seth. When the world had gone mad with corruption, Noah stood apart. He didn't follow the crowd. He followed a calling. And where did that come from? Perhaps it came from generations of quiet, faithful men and women who remembered the God of Seth, who kept the stories alive, who prayed, worshiped, and obeyed even when the world mocked them. Noah built an ark of wood, but Seth helped lay the spiritual foundation for that obedience. And this started with Seth, the one man who chose the path of righteousness when the world was falling apart. In a generation where darkness seemed to prevail, Seth's family began to call on the name of the Lord. What about your family? Could you be the Seth in your lineage, the appointed one who turns the tide? How often do we think our ordinary obedience doesn't matter? That no one sees our prayers, our discipline, or our generational healing? But Seth's story whispers, it matters more than you know. The early Jewish and Christian world saw Seth as more than just a figure in genealogy. In certain Gnostic texts, like the Gospel of the Egyptians and the Apocryphon of John, Seth is seen as a father of a divine race, the Sethians, who carried secret knowledge from God. In the Book of Jubilees, an ancient Jewish text, Seth is described as a righteous man whose descendants kept the commandments of the Lord. While this book isn't scripture, it reflects how deeply respected Seth was. Some rabbinic literature refers to him as the father of all righteousness. Even more fascinating is the idea that Seth was seen as a prophet of sorts. Some early Christian thinkers like Ephraim the Syrian and even Augustine saw the line of Seth as a foreshadowing of the church, a community set apart in a corrupt world. Augustine, the church father, contrasted the city of God, Seth's line, with the city of man, Cain's line. He believed Seth represented those who truly sought God in a decaying world. While these are not scripture and should be approached with caution, they give insight into the significance of Seth's story. He wasn't just a character in a genealogy. He represented hope, restoration, and preservation in a decaying world. The real question is, what does Seth's story mean to you? First, it reminds us that God often works through what seems small and insignificant. You might not be the loudest, you might not have the most dramatic testimony, but your quiet faithfulness could shape generations. Second, it reminds us that restoration is always possible. After Cain's violence and Abel's death, Adam and Eve could have given up, but they didn't. And God didn't. He appointed Seth. Maybe you feel like your family's story is filled with brokenness. Maybe you feel like nothing good can come from your line, but God is in the business of appointing new beginnings. You can be a Seth. Third, it invites us to be part of a greater story. Seth didn't know he was part of the messianic line. He didn't know that through him Jesus would one day be born. He just walked faithfully. You might not see the fruit of your obedience right now, but that doesn't mean it's not growing roots for something extraordinary. Now, let me ask you this. What would it look like to be a Seth in your generation? In a culture obsessed with platforms and performance, what if God is calling you to purity and perseverance? Maybe you're raising kids in a world that feels increasingly dark. Maybe you're the only believer in your family. Maybe you're faithfully showing up to church, praying and reading the word without applause. That's the spirit of Seth. You don't have to be famous to be fruitful. You just have to be faithful. When others are building monuments to themselves, you build an altar to God. When others boast about power, you walk in humility. When others drift away, you stand firm. Because who knows? Maybe through your obedience, your children or your children's children will change the world. So what if Seth was the most important son of Adam? Not because of power, not because of fame, but because he quietly carried the flame of faith. Not because he did something flashy, but because he was faithful. Because when the world turned dark, he chose light. Because his life whispered a yes to God, and that yes echoed through generations. Because he called on the name of the Lord. Because through him, a line of righteousness was born. And maybe, just maybe, God is calling you to carry that same spirit today. This is Divine Mysteries, where we uncover the hidden truths, prophetic patterns, and deeper meanings in the pages of Scripture. If today's message moved you, don't just scroll past it. Share it. Reflect on it. Drop a comment below about what stood up most to you. And remember, when the world goes dark, be like Seth. Be the one who calls on the name of the Lord. Until next time, stay faithful and rooted in truth.